So during development, everyone gets sex chromosomes, X and Y, but as we learned in our genetics class, not everyone gets only two copies. How is gender determined for those who have more than one copy?
Gender in humans is actually determined by the presence of the Y chromosome. The Y chromosome has a very specific gene on it called SRY, which is responsible for stimulating male sexual development. So if you have the SRY gene, you're going to develop sexually as a male. And if you don't have it, you're going to develop sexually as a female. And so it doesn't really matter how many copies of the X chromosome you have or how many copies of the Y chromosome all that really matters is how many copies of the Y chromosome that you have. And if you have one copy or more, you will develop as a male. And if you have no Y chromosomes, you'll develop as a female.
Okay. Tell me about what makes the sex chromosomes X and Y special. For example, some diseases are sex-linked. What distinguishes X and Y?
So the X and Y chromosomes are really different from each other in terms of their DNA sequences. The X chromosome is actually, there's 23 different chromosomes, 24 if we count the Y chromosome in human cells, and the X chromosome is about the 7th or 8th largest of them, whereas the Y chromosome is by far the smallest. So the chromosomes vary quite a bit in terms of their size, and that's one major difference. Of course, the reason they're different in sizes is because they have different amounts of DNA. It's not just that they have different amounts of DNA, but the genes that are on those chromosomes are really variable as well. So they actually do share a very short portion of the X and the Y, share similar DNA sequences, and that's called the pseudo-autosomal region. But the majority of the X chromosome and the majority of the Y chromosome are unique. So the genes that are on the X chromosome will be present in both males and females. So those can be genes that are responsible for any part of normal human development. But the genes on the Y chromosome are normally only found in men, and so those can't be critical for normal human development in both sexes because they're only present in the one sex. So the genes that are unique to the Y chromosome are generally genes that are responsible for things like spermatogenesis.
Genetically and biologically, what do you think the difference between gender and sexuality is?
The difference between gender and sexuality, genetically and biologically. I think, the difference between, obviously, the sexual characteristics that one develops are very heavily controlled by the genetic composition. So the SRY gene stimulates testosterone development, and testosterone is a hormone that then drives the development of the male sexual characteristics, and so that's how we end up getting biologically different sexes, men versus women. In terms of gender, it's not as straightforward. Gender identity for people is probably partly controlled by the genes. I don't doubt that it is. That's my field, of research is developmental genetics. I'm sure that it is, but there's other things that happen during our development that are more stochastic in their nature, and the brain in particular develops in a very stochastic way, which is why some people are more emotional than other people, and some people are are right-handed versus left-handed. There are various differences that have both genetic components and just sort of random components to them as well. And my belief, and I'm not an expert in this at all, but my belief is that gender identity has a lot of stochastic nature associated with it. So while there may be a predisposition to identifying with one sex versus the other, that's maybe controlled by the genetics. I think there's just other sort of the random nature of the way the brain develops can sway you more in one direction versus the other.
How do the sex chromosomes communicate with the rest of the developing body to determine development?
So that gets back to the hormone issues as well. So when you have the Y chromosome present and the expression of testosterone is induced at very high levels, that's going to drive the expression of the other genes that are responsible for developing the primary and secondary sexual characteristics. So obviously things like whether you develop, a penis versus a vagina, or a uterus versus, the testis, ovaries versus a testis, things like that. But also the secondary sexual characteristics, like how much body hair we develop. Do we grow facial hair if you're a man versus not, or not as much if you're a woman, the amount of chest hair that develops as well, things like that. So those are all ultimately derived based on the presence of these hormones, which help to control what downstream genes are expressed and therefore what characteristics we end up having.
Okay, thank you very much.